Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. I'm Dave Seaver of Mind Alive, and I want to thank each and every one of you for entrusting me enough to attend my lectures, and hopefully I'll share some valuable information with you, and we'll see how it goes. Meanwhile, a couple things. We've already done the physiology of audiovisual entrainment, so if you want to see all the physiological aspects of entrainment, it's quite encompassing, and I help you get started on understanding why entrainment works the way it does. We also went through the brain brightening aspects of entrainment, which had to do with cognition. And so we looked at ADD, a little bit of autism. We looked at seniors, boosting cognition in seniors, boosting grade point average and cognition in college students, reducing worry in college students, and that was all done in June. So this is going to be all these studies that are basically non-cognitive, although still cognition gets into all of this, into all research anyway. No matter what you do, if you're working with pain or you're working with seasonal affective disorder or something else, you're certainly going to be affecting cognition. So we can never get away from cognition entirely, which is fine enough for me. But this is going to be looking more on the stress side of things and different aspects of entrainment. So we're going to do a little bit of a review on the physiology of entrainment. So of all the things that I know so far that entrainment does, I mean, the whole concept of entrainment is that there is a frequency following a response. So we put a frequency into the brain, typically with flashing lights or pulsing tones in this case, and the brain will start to mimic that frequency to some degree. But in the process, people will often dissociate into a deep trance type of a state. And because fear gets the brain ruminating and anxiety gets the brain ruminating, and so many people are in fear and anxiety and stress these days, that further exacerbates a flight or fight response, and cortisol activity and all that stuff from the adrenals shuts down serotonin and dopamine, drives up norepinephrine, and so on. And in the dissociative process, it appears that entrainment breaks the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or the flight or fight axis, basically, and it breaks it extremely effectively. I'll show you a study where they showed it broken in 2 minutes. We know entrainment increases cerebral blood flow. There's plenty of research on that. Also increases lactate and anaerobic ATP. Lactate and ATP are real critical, especially in traumatic brain injuries and concussions, where lactate becomes low and ATP becomes low, which in turn also shuts down norepinephrine, and the brain cannot function. And we typically see that as quite a flat line on an EEG. Entrainment has been shown to drive up lactate and ATP 260% in a 5-minute period. So it's very valuable for that. Entrainment also balances neurotransmitters, which we'll look at. It drives up serotonin again, primarily, and endorphins as well. It excites glia and neurons. And some of this research is playing out in the whole Alzheimer's area, which we looked at in the other lecture on brain brightening, which I did back in June. It increases heat shock protein, and heat shock protein is fascinating. It prevents bacterial and viral infections, and it also protects the brain from pathogens, and it also reduces inflammation, and it's naturally increased with entrainment. If anyone here wants to see some of these studies, I'm certainly happy to get them to you. And a recent study came out by a lady named Singer and her group showing that it activates cytokines with gamma stimulation. And that's a whole fascinating area in itself. We're going to be looking on the dissociation side, and I've covered a fair bit of dissociation work already in the physiology section. I'm not going to cover it there. I'm just going to look at some studies where dissociation went to work as a benefit in some of these clinical studies, rather than showing you the actual dissociation studies that prove the dissociation aspect of it. And this was some of the first work that was done with entrainment. Now, entrainment, that concept of driving brainwaves was discovered in 1934 by Adrian and Matthews. They noted, of course, that you could drive an eyes closed alpha rhythm faster or slower, and it would match the frequency of the stimulation. And since then, hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of studies have been done on flashing lights in, brainwaves out, or pulsing tones in, brainwaves out, or tactile stimulation, tapping a hand, brainwaves out. But very few people looked at the subjective experience of using entrainment. So Kroger and Schneider were amongst the first people to look at the subjective experience. Other people did too, like W. Gray Walters. He looked at it, and some other people did as well. But what happened with William Kroger was very pivotal in the development of entrainment. And he was a physician with the US military. And he was noting that radar operators on bomber planes and on battleships would go into a trance. And this is all covered, by the way, in the physiology lecture that I did back in May. And you can see examples of that. But anyway, the blip that would be on the radar, blipping and blipping, would lull them into this trance, and they would watch the enemy come on screen and not do anything about it because they were too tranced out. So he used those observations that he had made, and he applied it and had a machine made by Sidney Schneider, and they were using it for hypnotic induction. And so this is one of the first studies done on that. And you can see here, within the 5 to 6 minute time frame, in this case 5 minutes, 78% of everyone was in a hypnotic trance, which is really a form of dissociation. They're really much the same thing. But they would then use this to give people guided imageries and hypnotic suggestions and so on at this point. You're going to see there's this magical moment that happens right around the 5 to 6 minute period most of the time. Since then, Sadov was using entrainment, using the old brainwave synchronizer, and he was using it to reduce anesthesia. And he was using alpha theta frequencies. Now in the 60s, getting surgery under general anesthesia was rather risky. You had a good 10% chance of dying from the anesthesia because it wasn't a good science yet. And they didn't have good monitoring like they do now as well, where they monitor all your vital signs. So it's risky to have to get put under a general anesthesia. And the more anxious a patient was, the more, of course, jacked up they were on cortisol and norepinephrine and so on, and the more anesthesia you had to give them to knock them out for the surgery, which caused then further risks of toxicity and death. So by using entrainment, they were able to cut the anesthesia in half, which then made for more successful outcomes. Margolis then also published a study looking at alpha theta frequencies in the dental office. And the old dental offices, there was always a big tray right on the side of the chair, and the dentist had all his tools on that tray. He would literally put this brainwave synchronizer, which was a pretty big device in those days, and he would put it on the tray and trance out his patient, probably along with himself. Anyway, he would use it with hypnotic suggestions to reduce the anesthesia, to control the anxiety, which a lot of dental patients have. Use it to control gagging, to speed healing, and also for post-hypnotic anesthesia. Now here's an example of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis. And we can see how stress activates parts of the brain under stress. Corticotrophin releasing hormone gets released. It activates down into the adrenals. Cortisol is released. And that is great for flight or fight. But if we get too much of it, it starts to become a problem. And it actually starts to shut down sections of the brain. Stress has been shown to shut down blood flow in prefrontal lobes. And so it's easy to become ADHD-like under stress. But we've got plenty of brain maps showing that FP1, FP2, right above the eyebrows, get shut down with chronic stress from cortisol damage to those sections. And in psychiatry, it's referred to as ventral medial depression. It's not something our profession recognizes too much, but there's all kinds of fibers from there that descend into the amygdala. And when you see two alpha hotspots showing up at FP1, FP2, these people have real difficulty inhibiting fear responses. So all kinds of things will trigger them into fear. If they watch a scary movie, They're almost tearing the arms off the chairs. They cannot regulate their fear, even something as simple as a scary movie, not to mention all kinds of life events that are scary enough on their own. This is Tom Hawes's work back in 1996. And here we can see he's looking at finger temperature. Well, finger temperature has well been documented as a signature or a reflection of activated parasympathetic activity and a shutting down of sympathetic activity. Sympathetic activity constricts vascular blood vessels and so on, smooth muscle, and parasympathetic dilates it. And you can see at about the 6-minute mark, this person's finger temperature was very cold. That's about 22 degrees Celsius. Warms up tremendously. And I've always used entrainment when I do finger temperature training in people with vascular headaches, because it always ensures a successful outcome. Here's an example of skin conductance, and people who are stressed typically have sweaty hands. And we can see at about the 6-minute mark, this person started relaxing deeply as they dissociated into that meditative trance. Now, there's a term that I use. When people dissociate, we always see them restabilize or return to homeostasis. I call it DAR, dissociation and restabilization. We see this case after case after case, at least 95% of the time. It's close to 100% successful in putting people in these trance-like states when you use entrainment. Here we're looking at forearm tension in a golfer who can't golf too well because he has too much tense muscle in his forearms. And in this case, 4 to 5 minutes, he started showing profound relaxation. Here we are looking at a study done on bruxism by a fellow named Mans in 1981. And I worked at the U of A, University of Alberta, for about 8 years, designing a TMJ research lab. And also I did a lot of clinical work with that lab too, as we were perfecting techniques for treating TMJ dysfunction. And TMJ is temporomandibular joint dysfunction. More modern terms are calling it TMD, or temporomandibular dysfunction. Either its way, it's a dysfunction of the temporomandibular joint, which is largely muscle-based. The joint itself is just a free-hanging joint, and there's nothing special about it. But when the muscles go into spasm, that joint can get really painful. So here we are. We're looking in this first block right here, symptoms less than a year, and that's of TMJ symptoms, and then participants with symptoms greater than a year. And what we're seeing here is that when you look at bruxism, emotional tension, muscle fatigue, so emotional tension is a big factor in all of this. Insomnia, dizziness, headache, TMJ pain, masticatory or jaw closing muscle pain like masseter and temporalis muscles, neck muscle pain, ear issues with otalgia, mastoid process pain, articular clicking, mandibular deviation, so your jaw swinging sideways when it opens, and restricted openings from so much muscle tension, and also often cartilage problems in the jaw. And you can see that with 20 sessions of entrainment, a lot of them were at 0 for symptoms. They're very, very effective. If they had symptoms over a year, it wasn't as effective, so this is a more chronic condition, but still it was exceptionally effective to use entrainment for TMJ issues. And when I was working at the University of Alberta, it was in 1984, where I started development of audiovisual entrainment, and I was doing it for a professor with performing arts who had heard of entrainment and wanted me to design a system to help him get his students over stage fright. I had never heard of audiovisual entrainment prior to that time. And then I started to see how easily we could use it for treating TMJ. So that was sort of the next stage. And then things have gone on from there. And here are my humble beginnings at the University of Alberta. As I was trying to design all this equipment, there was some stuff that Dr. Norman Thomas, who was the professor I worked for, we had dreams, or at least he had dreams that we were going to get rich, developing some of this TMJ diagnostics and treatment equipment. It never came to fruition for the most part, to design and sell some things. mandibular stimulators, and a few other things, and some biofeedback gear that I sold for a few years. One was called a Brux stopper. And if you ground your teeth in your sleep, it would ring an alarm and wake you up, to the point where you probably started developing chronic fatigue. I don't know if it was the best solution for that. But this here was very interesting. One of the things that happen when you go to a dental office and they open your mouth wide is you stretch some muscles like the masseter and temporalis. And in the process of them getting stretched, muscle spindles get activated because they sense how long a muscle is. And when they get stretched, they activate and they send outputs back to the brain, telling the brain that that muscle is stretched. And the brain doesn't like a muscle being off of its normal resting physiological length. So the brain then sends EMG output down to shorten the muscle. And many of you may have experienced this, where you go to a dentist and you're opening your mouth wide, perhaps you're getting a filling or something, tooth cleaning or other work, and you have your mouth open wide for a long time, and it's getting stiffer and stiffer. And then at some point, the dentist will say, okay, we're done, you can close now, and your jaw kind of goes twang because there's so much tension in those muscles. And the process of the jaw going twang and snapping back or snapping closed quickly, another little muscle in there called the lateral pterygoid, which is connected to the interarticular disc, which is a donut-shaped cartilage that separates the ball of your mandible called the condyle. It separates it from the maxilla or your skull. And they slide together when you open and close. But that little muscle now also is short and tight. And when your jaw pops up, it'll tear the cartilage off the ball of your mandible. And then you go click, 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 click when you open and close. And later you can comment on this, but I tell you, many, many people have a clicking sound after they've had dental work done. And that is the dentist damaging your joints, basically because they don't understand that there's a tightening effect that occurs when you stretch a muscle. Yeah, dentists do trigger their own degree of TMJ dysfunction and jaw pain and so on because of this effect. And if you're stressed or anxious, and how many people aren't anxious or, when they go to a dentist, and that exacerbates the effect because there's another part of the muscle spindle that is tied to the reticular activating system, and it's very, very stress sensitive, and it'll make that muscle 3 times as tight as just opening wide. So this here was a little study we did without the fear component. We just had people open their jaws wide and hold them for 5 minutes. And you can see the red graph is the masseter muscle tensing up and showing that tension in there. If we entrain them, the jaw is much, much more relaxed. And about the 5-minute mark, as they dissociate, it gets even more relaxed. So if you go to a dentist, it's in your best interest to use entrainment at the same time to keep your jaw relaxed. I've been using entrainment for all of 30 years when I go to the dentist. And sometimes I'm so tranced out that when the dentist is done his work, I feel like I just had a really relaxing meditation. And that's not a normal dental experience for most people. Now, this is the pivotal study that got me thinking that entrainment was something real instead of some kind of a new age fad. Because up to that point, I wasn't sure. And up to that point, a lot of people were marking entrainment really as sort of a new age fad. So anyway, these are TMJ patients with symptoms greater than 10 years and all struggling with a lot of pain. And one of the things that we notice is that there was a study by Bob Yam called TMJ personality. And TMJ people, there's a group of them that have this personality where if you give them a task, they all tense up when they do the task. It causes TMJ issues. So this group here, in this first section here, they were given a guided imagery that has been shown in psychological studies to have a relaxation effect. So we thought, okay, this should be relaxing, except that we said to the participants, when we're done this guided imagery, we expect you to be relaxed. And that expectation caused them all to tense up. And that's the green line showing their masseter getting tenser and tenser. The guided imagery ended here, and then they actually started to relax because they didn't have to now try to relax. And you can see their fingers are getting colder and colder. Again, sign of sympathetic activation. Set up the old David one, and I should mention the word David was a word that the instructor in performing arts, because I was designing the first machine for him, it was a name that he had picked for the device. I was going to call it NeuroStim or Brain Sync or something else. But he called it David, and David stands for Digital Audio Visual Integration Device. So integrating brainwaves with digital audio visual stimulation. Anyway, we had a little setup time here, then we officially kind of ran it here, though it did run for about a minute in this period. And we can see at about 5 minutes, hands start warming and masseter tension gets extremely relaxed. Here we're looking at full spectrum EMG from 20 hertz to 1 kilohertz, so slow twitch and fast twitch fiber. And to be relaxed between under 1.5 microvolts with that such a wide spectrum is a very difficult thing to do. So when I was doing the TMJ research, one of the things that really stood out was that there was a psychological component to TMJ issues. I started using the life event scale, or the Holmes-Ray scale is one of the terms for it, and a pretty significant intake form. And what we found was that 90% of all of our patients were women, first of all, and they were wives of oil workers. And you're like, well, why would a wife of an oil worker have TMJ problems? Well, there are some reasons for that. One of the reasons is that in the 80s, just like now, oil dropped to $15 a barrel. And in Alberta, we have a great deal of oil, millions of barrels of oil in Alberta where we live here, except most of it's in the oil sands, and it's difficult to extract. So it's expensive. So when oil falls below $30 a barrel, people start getting laid off or start getting worried about being laid off. And in the 1980s, there were thousands of people who walked away from their homes or sold them for $1 because they could not afford to be there anymore. Plus, interest rates in those days in Canada were 18% for a mortgage. It was a brutal time to be buying a house. I bought a house at that time, and I tell you, there was days that were fairly stressful. And I'm glad those are behind me. So, a worsening in financial status, an increase in arguments with spouse, and often the mom had to return to work to supplement income at a job she didn't like. And those were the three factors that precipitated TMJ pain by 3 to 6 months. So clearly a psychological input into all of this. Okay, anxiety and AVE. Okay, so here we are looking at what happens during a fear response. And when we look at fear responses, often endorphins may go up a little as we try to protect ourselves from pain, because the brain assumes we're going to be going into battle and could get hurt. But serotonin crashes. And the thing about serotonin is that soon as we have a fearful thought, whether it's paying bills, stuff with our children, politics, viruses like now, anything that's a fearful thought, serotonin crashes within 3 seconds, because we can't engage in battle, which nature assumes is probably going to be the outcome of this. If we're high in serotonin, we just won't do it. We just aren't that engaged to be into a battle situation if we're high on serotonin. So it crashes serotonin very quickly. And in the process, also norepinephrine, which is the brain's adrenaline, skyrockets. And also the adrenals kick in after that point as well. So the HPA axis engages. And away we go as we prepare for battle. And that's great for acute or momentary events where where our lives are at stake. But when we're living in this zone all the time, of course, we pay a price for it. And this would be an example of temporary falling of serotonin and scooting up in norepinephrine, since norepinephrine affects heart rate as well as adrenaline, which should be activated by the HPA axis. And this is a root canal. And you can see starting procedures, injection, x-ray, and so on. The part of the procedure that causes the most stress in people in general is the injection. And to be laying down in a chair and having a heart rate of 107 beats per minute, well, that's a fairly fast heart rate. If you do entrainment in the alpha band, the heart rate was reduced to about 93. And simply by adding that easy, slow kind of new age music for relaxation and further dissociating just from playing that kind of music, reduce the heart rate down to 85. So that is the power of dissociation and getting out of flight or fight. Now, this was a study done in Russia, and they're looking at test anxiety, and they had students look at their favorite color, red, green, or blue, and then they had another test where they would be rotating the colors every 10 or 20 seconds. They were rotating the colors through to see if their favorite color was actually better than rotated colors versus baseline. And they entrained for 2 minutes on their favorite color and 2 more minutes later on the rotation of colors. Only 2 minutes. So that's very little entrainment time. And you can see with the highly anxious students, 2 minutes of entrainment brought their anxiety down significantly. Brought it down to, certainly brought it down by a full third, if not more. Now, if you were moderately anxious, and they even had some that were mildly anxious, there's a ceiling effect, of course, because you're more relaxed in the first place. So entrainment effects weren't as strong. But that was showing anyway how fast entrainment can work. A 2-minute period can have a profound calming effect. I was typically working with about 6 minutes, 5 minutes. I have seen it even faster than that, but they were looking at 2 minutes. And then they also looked at to see how stress and anxiety interferes with performance. So they have this, what they call an Anfimov proofreading test. And it looks at their comprehension of reading and also how many characters per minute can they read. Well, you can see the baseline, the comprehension and catching of issues with the proofreading is poor. And we can see here that though, and the characters read per minute are low. But just following 2 minutes of entrainment had a remarkable difference on their cognitive aspects of reading and on number of characters read. So yeah, you can really speed things up and have more accuracy at the same time if you're more relaxed. And it was a very quick process. Now, I've been doing myself EEGs and QEEGs for a very long time, well over 20 years, I think 25 years. This is a fellow with ADHD, OCD, and severe anxiety. And his anxiety has a lot to do with the fact that he's always afraid he's making mistakes and he's not paying attention. And he works in construction. And in construction, he has a tendency to make mistakes and someone gets injured. Maybe you forget to put a bolt in the scaffold and the scaffold will fall down, or other things with heavy machinery and so on. So he always has a lot of anxiety that he's going to make a mistake. And we can see him here just pounding out lots and lots of beta. You can see there's also spikes, which are heart rate artifact in that record too, but which is just a natural artifact that got in. But we can see he's high on norepinephrine, which is speeding up his alpha overall. There's an anxiety component to having a fast running alpha, but also take a look at 29 to 35 hertz. I mean, he's just racing. You may as well be frying an egg on his brain. That's kind of what we're looking at here. I put him on the same frequencies that, in a sense, you almost shouldn't get. I put him on 17 to 20 hertz entrainment to see if the dissociative aspect up there was going to calm him down. And the reason why I use 17 to 20 is that we find that the more wound up a person is, the higher the frequency we have to use to overload their attention circuits and cause them to then drift into a trance. If I put them on just like a low alpha or theta, it probably would actually increase his anxiety. And he'd be counting the flashes because he is so hyper alert. So we have to overwhelm them with stimulation, and the more anxious they are, the faster we go. Or we'll use a blend of frequencies like an alpha, beta, or SMR beta, something like that. And that helps really to knock them out. So anyway, this is him now, 4 minutes into entrainment. And I was profoundly, impressed that it was so fast with this fella. You can see his heart rate now. You can see it better because we've cleaned up some of that beta activity that was all over the place, but much, much cleaner as compared to this. And I hadn't seen that Russian study. Of course, it hadn't come out yet. And so the Russian study has confirmed what I was observing over all the years about the power of entrainment to really calm someone down. Now, this is his brain map here. And you can see there's definitely an ADHD component, but all the anxiety is gone. Which shows that very, very well. Now, as people become chronically stressed over long periods of time, and they start to fatigue their dopamine in their brain, and dopamine is a reward chemical, it's approach behavior. And without dopamine, we fall into depression, and we need dopamine desperately. And if we don't make it endogenously, we will go look for it. And what's interesting is that junk food, especially sweets and sugars and ice cream and cake and all that stuff, is a giant dopamine generator. And stress is desserts spelled backwards. You almost got to wonder if there was an interesting Freudian backstory to that one. These are some of the things people do once they have been stressed for so long that they run out of dopamine as well. They go shopping. Shopping helps make us feel better and gives us a shot of dopamine. Drinking alcohol, eating junk food, the junkier it is, the more dopamine it makes. Smoking is a dopamine generator. Gambling, meditation, anything with neon lights, typically, in my opinion, is probably a dopamine generator. Whether it's nightclubs or fast food restaurants, neon lights really get our attention, and they trigger approach behavior. And a dopamine response is approach behavior. It motivates us to do things. Hook up some people to have sex with, especially new people, generates massive amounts of dopamine, as much as cocaine does. And that's part of the huge infatuation process that people go through when they first meet each other, and they have some intense sex, and then they fall in this incredible infatuation with each other. And that's all about the dopamine drive. Validating ourselves that we're great, is a dopamine generator. Porn is dopamine. Sporting events, especially if our team wins, is a dopamine generator. Even things like, which I didn't put in here, rock concerts. The more you love a song, the more dopamine you will generate when you hear that song. So your favorite rock band only has to advertise in your city one day, and they could be sold out, because dopamine triggers approach behavior, and everybody then is buying tickets like mad. This is what fear does, and over long periods of time, we slide into depression when we deplete our norepinephrine, we deplete our dopamine, we deplete serotonin, and that also shuts down brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and we typically see shrinkage of the hippocampus and then memory impairments. Also, we develop severe insomnia in this state of mind, because socialization is so demanding on the brain, because there's hundreds of stimuli are happening per second when we're engaging socially with people. And in this state of mind, we just can't perceive it. This is what entrainment does on the neurotransmitter side. And this was a 30-minute session using white light at 10 hertz. And it was a spinal tap. So Sheely was looking at cerebral spinal fluid. And this was done in Chicago in winter. And Chicago's pretty gloomy in winter, a lot of seasonal affective disorder, and which involves melatonin. And he found a 6% drop in melatonin when they used the entrainment at 10 hertz. Beta endorphins went up 13%. Serotonin went up 23%. And norepinephrine went up 18%. I call this the Christmas brain, but it could be the birthday brain, the Ramadan brain, the celebration brain. When we're in exciting events, whether it's Christmas or birthdays or celebration, a wedding, I mean, we're excited. We feel really good. We're happy. We're with our friends. The world and life universe and everything is a wonderful place. And so our serotonin levels are higher than average because we're in this great state of mind. But we're also excited. We're not excited like someone in flight or fight where norepinephrine is 200 or 300% higher. We're mildly excited and we're socially engaging with people. We're saying, hi, how are you? I haven't seen you for months or years. Tell me about your life. You know, I'm so excited to see you. So this state of mind is a beautiful place to be, and entrainment generates it naturally. As a little side note, the colors red and green also promote this brain state. And if you go to Vegas and you go into the gambling halls, you'll see the carpets are primarily red and green. There's usually splashes of yellow and blue in them, but they're red and green primarily. Red activates us physically. Green makes us feel safe and peaceful. So if you feel safe and you're feeling motivated physically, what's the odds you might gamble more? That's the whole idea. We're going to look a little bit more about depression. Basically, the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex at F3 is the site where happiness resides. And there have been several studies on this. F4 is more to do with negative aspects. So approach behavior on the left, happiness, dopamine. The nucleus accumbens is right underneath this. Avoidance behavior, threatening behavior, stay away of stuff. What's going to go wrong? Anxiety on the right-hand side. And this is here a typical signature of depression. And we see the happy side is shut down because alpha is an idling rhythm. So this is shut down and the fear side is more engaged. Now, this particular gentleman, who's a 38-year-old male, he was afraid to drive his car from one end of our city to the other end because there's a river in the middle. He was afraid to cross the river because he was always afraid he would just put his car in park and jump off the bridge. That was the severity of his depression. And also because of all of his negative thought, because the right side is more activated, you can see all that beta activity spilling from the anxiety of his negative thought. So that is what happens when you show this signature. Well, I'll show another example of this. The signature, the way I've zoomed into his signature, you don't see it very strongly. If I zoomed out more, it was more apparent. But I wanted to zoom in just to show what another perspective on it. 19-year-old male, he couldn't wake up before noon. He had such depression. And it was largely related, in this case, it was largely related to an inability to absorb magnesium. And his father had depression, and so did his grandfather. They were eventually all treated with a digestive enzyme that assimilated magnesium, and they were all happy as larks a week after they got onto that. But before we discovered that, I had to help him through as best I could. And so we're looking at his signature here, but it was still actually more so on the left-hand side. And the left temporal was showing up as well. And some beta also showing up here. He was in rough shape in this state. Putting him on entrainment using an alpha beta protocol in 30 minutes cut his depression down to about a quarter of what it was. 8 standard deviations is very extreme. Now, one of the things about entrainment is that entrainment inhibits the half frequency of stimulation, roughly between 10 and 20 hertz. And we've known this for decades. And having conversations with Tom Kalura of Brainmaster, we eventually published a chapter together. We co-authored a chapter in a couple of different physiology books showing this effect. And this was a really nice single electrode recording that Tom had made on an ADHD boy who was really dominant at 7 hertz. And we can see all of this activity right here. And then Tom gave him 14, and very quickly, all that 7 was suppressed right out. Well, we have a similar technique with that. In this case, we were doing it with depression. They will show that heightened alpha on the left-hand side. So we give them beta stimulation on the right fields of the glasses and the right headphone to not only maybe drive up beta on the left some, because usually their beta is down, but mostly to suppress that alpha on the left-hand side. And this was, I know what I'm showing here. This is this guy's post. So again, you see his pre right here. very, very hot. And here's his post. So 30 minutes later, we had him down to 4 standard deviations using this technique. And we're also giving him alpha on the left side to increase alpha on the right. In this case, he was so extreme with alpha on both sides, it took alpha down significantly on both sides. Still slightly more alpha on the left than there is on the right, but he was able to function now a whole lot better. Started going back to school earlier, not after lunch, but at 10 a.m. And then when they discovered the digestive enzyme effect with his magnesium, then he had a completely normal life after and went on to college. But at least entrainment got him through these rough times. Now, this is it. Now, this study here, despite the fact that we use alpha beta officially for entrainment, this was done by Cantor and Stevens. And they used SMR, sensory motor rhythm, at 14 hertz. And they did 2 parts to their study. This group got entrainment right off the bat for 1 month. And when they ended entrainment here and gave them sham, they still continued to improve. We see that effect all the time, whether it's cognitive decline in seniors. We've got an Alzheimer's case that dramatically showed that. Brain injuries show it. That once the brain is kicked back into functioning, it continues to improve on its own. Now, this group here got the sham for the first month, minor improvement, and then they got entrainment here. And so it showed that SMR across the board works very well also for treating depression. Now, obviously, this is not working on a frequency model anymore. And because entrainment increases neurotransmitters, because it increases cerebral blood flow, and people with depression typically have hypoperfusion of cerebral blood flow, usually more on the left frontal area, and other aspects of entrainment, maybe even the dissociative aspect of entrainment, just getting people very calm and getting them relaxed again, because stress and anxiety has been shown to shut down cerebral blood flow in the frontal lobes. So all of these factors tie in to treating depression. So he's using a non-frequency model in this case to treat the depression, whereas we went on a frequency model. In both cases, it worked just fine. So what about substance abuse then? And this is a study done by Ed Pygott, Greg Alter, and Don Alfert, who I don't know. They were looking at a rehab center in Florida, and they were looking at these patients who, of course, had drug rehab issues. And they were combining, they're calling it audiovisual stimulation in this case, because we always randomize our stimulation a little bit, so it's not pure entrainment. So they called it AVS instead of AVE. And this is the issues that they're having. Most people who start mindfulness training stop long before experiencing its many benefits, because mindfulness training is very slow to teach someone cognitively how to do it. And these people don't have cognitive ability because they're addicts and they're desperate. So you need something that just hits them and just takes them away and does it magically. And that's what they were doing with the entrainment. They all had an hour-long mindfulness meditation training that included AVS 3 mornings per week for 4 weeks. One of the mindfulness lessons from the client workbook was part of it. There were 12 of them. A 30-minute entrainment session on the Mind Alive device, the PAL device that we used to make, happened also. And all sessions included heart rate variability, which we build into our protocols. There's a heartbeat that plays in the headphones. And you can pace your breathing to it by breathing in for 2 heartbeats and then exhaling for 2 heartbeats. And it works very well for heart rate variability training. In fact, we'll be teaching a lecture on that coming up fairly soon and showing how we do it with the Spectrum eye sets. They also listen to mindfulness audio coaching recordings during their entrainment sessions. You can plug in to the device and play any kind of audio you want while the entrainment is going on. There were 65 clients. They all did the Beck Depression Inventory, the State Trait Anxiety Index, and the Philadelphia, Minnesota scale, or mindfulness scale, sorry, within 2 days of admission into the facility. Here's what they found. They looked at different groups, highly symptomatic groups, pre and post, And here's their baseline, looking at the Beck depression, the BDI, the state anxiety, and the trait anxiety. And we can see here, all high. Post, much improved. They looked at the baseline of the mildly symptomatic people, which wasn't as severe, and then they looked at the post again. You can see that there gets to be a ceiling effect, of course, if you're not so extreme. You can only make people so non-symptomatic. But for the extreme cases, entrainment works the best. And of course, those are all your failures are in the extreme cases. So you see all these improvements across the board, especially in your most troublesome clients or patients. So what they had observed on follow-up, they had the 12 sessions, and that had the highest rate of clinically significant change after 4 weeks. Less rumination, and then the other techniques that they were using. The treatment gains were maintained in the 3-month follow-up despite no further treatment. And now I think we see that with Cantor's depression study. Budzinski has clearly shown that in college students that their cognitive gains are maintained 4 months post-entrainment. We've seen this with seniors where cognitive gains are maintained. There was one case where Budzinski and Leslie Sherlin looked at a severe Alzheimer's case who made a complete recovery using entrainment and continued to improve after the entrainment was ended. Improved for months after and moved out of the senior home and moved back into her own home and had a completely normal life. So entrainment does have an effect that lingers and continues to improve after its cessation. So yes, so it's a good therapy. You can see, due to its apparent effectiveness in disrupting ruminative thinking. The study's intent was to see if AVS could assist clients learn how to quiet their minds and focus on their present moment experience. Now, it is because of these effects, these immediate and dramatic calming effects of entrainment, that it lends it so well for triage in those who are ready to kill themselves or someone else. And some clinicians are using this not just on substance abusers, but Becky Basham has been using this on football players and other people struggling with severe concussions. And these people are very unstable, and they're either hurting themselves or other people. And entrainment instantly calms them down and takes them out of that danger zone. So they can continue with entrainment and also apply other therapies, whether it's talk therapy or neurofeedback or whatever else they're trying to do. Use entrainment to get them stable. So it has a great triage effect. We also use entrainment a great deal with the Semper Fi Marine Fund. And we have sold several thousand devices to that fund for helping Marines with PTSD and help keeping them stable. And the VA centers in the United States are seeing dramatic improvements, both in cognition and in emotional stability amongst war vets who use entrainment. Another thing about entrainment that is very interesting, and this you will not have seen before, I'm sure. I'll be lecturing on this more in the future. When you have long-term cortisol, it typically damages the left temporal lobes. The amygdala gets damaged, the hippocampus gets damaged, the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex gets shut down as well, and people start developing night seizures. And when they're falling asleep, they will start to have spiking waves. It's subclinical, but it partially wakes them up hundreds of times a night. I can see people showing seizure wavelets 2 or 3 times a minute in some cases when I'm doing an EEG. And when you do an EEG just eyes closed, as we're seeing with this person, well, they just look very normal. Got some alpha waves going on. They're mostly in the parietal occipital area. It looks pretty nice. And you'd say, no, you're good. I don't know why you have severe insomnia, why you can't function, and why you're exhausted, and why you got emotional problems and whatever else, because you wouldn't see it. But if you entrain them and put them to sleep, so we're going to use entrainment in this case as a sleep lab. We put them to sleep with entrainment. Well, now we see the seizure activity going on. And the entrainment is not causing the seizure. Remember that, it's not. People used to think it was, but it's not. Because when the entrainment ends, they will continue to show these spike in waves until they wake up. But there's more to this story. So right now you can see this little spot that I highlighted right here at the start and end of that seizure wavelet. And you can see down here where the dipoles are. And that's where the seizure is going on in this person. Dramatic swings in voltage across those two sites. So one of the things about entrainment, when we see this type of a situation, is I send them home with a device, with entrainment, even though it might cause these spiking waves because they're sleeping. But these spiking waves are caused because of excess cortisol from a trauma. And we see this a lot in children who've been abused. Typically, it's more girls who've been sexually abused as children. And then a year later, after they've been pumped up on cortisol from the trauma, they start to then have sleep seizures. They go to talk therapy to try to talk it out, which might make it worse because now they're reliving their traumas, which is probably also then going to push up their cortisol. And we know cases of people who have these issues where talk therapy made them worse. They don't need talk therapy because neuroplasticity is the problem. And this is a neurological issue now, not a psychological issue. And so because entrainment breaks the HPA axis so effectively, in about 2 months, this seizure activity will end typically completely. And they will no longer be waking up all night long. They'll be having restful sleeps. They'll be feeling good. Their lives will get completely back to normal, and they'll have a good functional life. Also, it's real important, I think, in my opinion, to include omega-3s and also vitamin D. Vitamin D is definitely a neurostabilizer, and I put everybody on vitamin D at the same time, not a pill, but an oil. And it really helps them as well. Now let's take a look at tinnitus. One of the things about tinnitus, and there's going to be more and more research coming out on tinnitus and how much of tinnitus is really an ear problem or an ear auditory nerve problem, how much of it might actually be a brain problem in the main cortex. And stuff on theta gamma nesting rhythms are starting to come out. But some of that research might be flawed because people with depression and anxiety are also showing nesting problems with theta gamma rhythms. And so some of the research is focused on tinnitus, saying, well, this is a problem with tinnitus. However, most people with tinnitus have depression and anxiety. And unless you weed out that confound, you don't know that this is a tinnitus problem, or if the tinnitus problem is really a reflection of the anxiety depression problem. And so I'm looking into that research, and I'll have more to say on it later. I'm writing a very large article on it at the moment. And I think I'll end up concluding that tinnitus is not so much the problem in itself as it is a reflection of the depression and anxiety. But anyway, this study here was very pivotal in looking at tinnitus from a relaxation perspective. In this case, they had 17 patients with chronic tinnitus. They were using either the David XL or the PAL device. And they're going to try to dissociate them out of the distress from the tinnitus. So they were given 10 applications of entrainment of 30 minutes. It was kind of a weird frequency that I would not have personally used, but he started them at 10 hertz and slowly ramped down to 4, and then came back up to 7 to end the session, and that's what he had used. Here are the test measures, and looking at emotional impairments, hearing problems, cognitive impairment, sleep disorders, penetrance of tinnitus, so how much did it sort of get into their psyche and distress them, somatic discomfort, so that's bodily discomforts, mental impairments, and total severity of tinnitus impairment on their lives in general. And you can see pre-test means and post-test means with these people. We're also looking at emotional characteristics, anxious versus fearless or not having anxiety. And you can see changes there. Depressive versus happy mood, reductions there. Exhausted versus dynamic. Aggressive versus compliant. Inhibited versus spontaneous well-being. Abandonment versus feeling of security. and disordered general health. And we can see that entrainment settles all of this down. And these were their conclusions. The effect of photic entrainment, especially in tinnitus patients, is due to the fact that the affected persons do not have to listen to verbal instructions, such as during autogenic training or progressive muscle relaxation, which is complicated by the tinnitus. It's difficult to do cognitive tasks when you are struggling with these types of issues. And every time we see these kinds of issues, whether it's anxiety, well, which tinnitus certainly increases, but where people are challenged, are struggling to function cognitively because of their mental health issues, it's difficult to give them a cognitively demanding task, such as biofeedback or relaxation training and so on. They just need to be knocked out, relaxed, restabilized, shut down that HPA axis. Overall, tinnitus distress markedly decreased and general well-being improved. The photic entrainment technique is proposed as a relief for tinnitus patients who do not respond to conventional relaxation techniques. Every application markedly increased the peripheral blood circulation, thus indicating a relaxation effect. Average temperature increased by almost 4 degrees Celsius over 10 sessions. So again, it shows a sympathetic activation. The emotional and cognitive impairments, as well as subjective tinnitus distress, significantly decreased during treatment, while sleep disturbances showed a tendency towards improvement. Overall tinnitus distress markedly decreased and general well-being improved. So those are their comments. Now we'll look at migraine headache. Several thousand people have used this for migraine. Unfortunately, we don't have too much research on it. We just have a lot of anecdotes. But fortunately, Anderson did run a study on it. He looked at 7 subjects, average age 42 years, all had auroras and periodic vomiting. And he's calling this brainwave entrainment instead of audiovisual entrainment. But subject used, I'll call it audiovisual entrainment, at the onset of migraine. So when they felt the migraine starting to come on, they were to sit down on a park bench in a hallway, pull over in their car, recline their seat, pop on the device right away. And the trick was, I believe, in my opinion, to dissociate out of the migraine. But there could be more to it than that, because migraine also shows sweeping charges, DC charges, or low frequency potential sweep across a brain during migraines, and it could be an ischemic action that is occurring. I'm doing DC recordings now with my latest MITSAR device, the Smart BCI. And what I'm seeing is that in people who are showing epileptic waveforms, in the minutes prior to an epileptic discharge occurring, we're seeing the DC voltages just sliding into the negative prior to that paroxysm happening. And other studies have reported on that. So there are things that are going on in the brain, voltage-wise, on a more of a DC level that precipitate spike in wave activity and epilepsy and so on. One study that was published a few years ago, and I'm still disseminating this study, showed that the difference between hyperventilation and breathing carbon dioxide pushes the DC voltage by 2 or 3 millivolts, not microvolts, but millivolts, has a massive effect on the overall DC voltage on the brain, which affects brain waves quite significantly. So there's more to come out on this down in the future, and we'll be working towards that. Anyway, these people here had, in this group, they had control of frequency and intensity, which ran from about 2 hertz to 40, I believe. And they also, believe it or not, preferred brighter intensities. And most of them preferred alpha frequencies at the end of the day. But it's unusual to think of someone with a migraine preferring a brighter intensity. It's usually they don't like it light at all. But entrainment is a different effect. And we see that all the time. They do like it brighter, and I think it helps them dissociate, but maybe also it's increasing cerebral blood flow, but somehow it's stopping this massive charge that sweeps across the brain when the migraine occurs. Anyway, the use of entrainment for an average of 30 minutes. Pre-treatment migraines often lasted 6 hours on average. Post-treatment migraines were about 35 minutes. 49 of the 50 migraines were helped with entrainment, and 36 were actually stopped. We'll look at some chronic pain studies here, and we're going to look at some occupational pain. And these are people who have had injuries, and they had some pain, and they've got stress and anxiety. They're laid off of work, and that increases muscle tension, both smooth muscle and arteries, which is vasoconstriction, and ischemia, as well as striated muscle. Nothing worse than having skeletal muscle being tense because of anxiety and also having no blood supply. That just leads to a lot more pain. Just put a tourniquet around your arm and hold your arm out and see how many minutes you go before it gets very painful. Anyway, they get caught up in this cycle, and it gets worse and worse and worse. So eventually the injury is healed, and they still have severe pain because of all, in the aftermath of all the after effects of the anxieties and so on. So here's a person here. We can see this person who was 5 years post-injury. Some large shelves in a warehouse fell on him and broke and injured his back quite severely. Medication used reflects 35 extra strength Tylenol with codeine a day. So a great deal of medication. Pain level is still a 9. Anxiety is still very high, and suicide ideation is high. In fact, in this study, which were several cases, they only took people who had attempted suicide because they didn't want any liability issues with using the entrainment. We can see here now they were using, in this case, an older device that did not have dual frequency stimulation or randomization that we use nowadays, which works significantly better. And they were typically using slowed alpha in the 8-ish hertz range. I think it was about 8.5. And we can see here quality of life monitors, coping, hopefulness, self-esteem. So we can see here in their quality of life monitors, coping ability, hopefulness, self-esteem, family stability, rest and sleep, that they're doing very poorly at onset. Put them on entrainment, they started to improve quite quickly. But then they say, well, what if entrainment was a placebo? And I didn't agree with this because they've already tried 7 or 8 therapies previously with no results, which would mean they're not placebo prone. But anyway, they took them off the entrainment and they put them on 10s, and they put them on the wrong kind of 10s. And you can see hopefulness is going down, rest and sleep is going down, self-esteem is, everything's going down. At this point, they decided to take them back off. Family stability, they took them off the entrainment, put them back on. Things started to improve again, with the exception of family stability, which I'll explain in a moment. But you can see their hopefulness is really going up. Coping is going up. Rest and sleep is going up. Self-esteem is going up. And there's a little problem with family stability, which I'll talk about. What's going on with this here is that after 5 years being incapacitated and not having really any role in parenting or governing the household, he was getting back on track. And him and his wife had a few severe, strong arguments as they were trying to work out his role back into the family again, and which caused quite a bit of family instability. You can see, however, what's neat about this, despite the fact that there was marital conflict going on, hopefulness was still increasing. How much of that is because of the neurotransmitter improvements? I can't really say, but it's a nice effect to have nonetheless. A little study we had done using Beck Depression Scale and just using alpha stimulation. And we can see the pain levels are going down, and we can see Beck depression is going down over a 2-month period. Now, out of that, we had a placebo group, and in this placebo group was getting subdelta stimulation, but the hypothalamus plays out in a lot of things, and it plays out in hypertension, it plays out in pain, and other things. And we can see here that in this case, 3 out of the 5 controls who had 0.5 hertz to 1 hertz stimulation, inadvertently, we didn't realize it at the time, but we were activating their hypothalamus or treating their hypothalamus. And so the placebo group had pretty remarkable improvements, and they weren't supposed to have. We now have changed our placebo to be 0.1 hertz to 0.5, and we no longer get the strong effect in certain individuals with hypothalamic issues. Here's a fibromyalgia study that was done many years ago by a medical doctor who he himself had fibromyalgia. They had an entrainment group, they had a medical alternative medicine group, nutritional group, and some controls. Used the SCL90 and the ASI for tests. When we started this, we gave them sort of pre-assigned treatments or protocols that were based on the old EEG guided entrainment systems that a researcher had, and they didn't work. So what we ended up doing with our group was we said to them, you know, a lot of people with fibromyalgia have fibrofog when they wake up, and quite a few people in this group had to be cognitive in the morning because they were still working or they were taking kids to school, and they couldn't be all foggy headed. And we said, well, if that's your case, try beta when you wake up. Almost all of them have anxiety in the afternoon. We said, well, try alpha, try theta. And almost all of them had sleep issues. And we said, well, try delta. Now, what turned out to be interesting is that the beta worked very well for the fibrofog. Alpha worked very well for the anxiety in the afternoon. Theta did not work really at all, maybe one person or two. That was it. Delta worked remarkably well for sleep. But if you don't have fibromyalgia, delta does not work for sleep. And the only reason we can figure why delta works so well for sleep with fibro people is because they often have like eyes closed alpha at around 7 to 8 hertz. So it's possible that delta is their theta at that point in time. Because we have found since then that delta rarely works for insomnia. Other frequencies work a lot better. Taking a look at their measures, so individually, in the first month, they've got individual treatments, medical, entrainment, nutritional. And entrainment worked the best for anxiety, pain, fatigue, and energy compared to the other modalities. When they combined all of them together, so everyone was now getting medical, entrainment, and nutritional approaches, entrainment still turned out to be the best thing for depression, pain, sleep, and fatigue. Here's another study done looking at acute pain. And in this case, they were looking at binaural beats, which typically are very poor at entrainment, but they do have some dissociative aspects. But they do have mild amount of entrainment, but it's pretty small because they're not a true beat. They're more of a perception. And then they looked at photic entrainment. What they found is that 10 hertz alpha was the most effective frequency for reducing acute pain, which was being delivered, I believe, by a hot laser. They were shining on their skin. Photic stimulation was a fair bit more effective than binaural beats, which we would expect. Another study on rats right now, which I'm just parsing through, has shown that green also is the most effective color for reducing pain. So alpha with green might end up being the best pain reduction protocol. Here's an insomnia study we had done. It was quite small, but it proved a couple of things that were very important. 8 participants, 3-week baseline, 2 months of treatment, 3-week follow-up, so on. Mean age is 44. Looking at sleep onset latencies. Now, these people were getting theta, and we can see that theta worked quite well. I thought that we were doing delta, but my student had misheard me and was using theta instead of delta. So I was like, that's interesting. Awakenings upon sleep onset were improved. Night awakenings, frequency went down. Feeling upon awake was improved. Quality of sleep was improved. Depression went down. Somatic causes, which some people had sore backs and issues like that, that improved some, but cognitive causes, so issues throughout the day and stresses and anxieties were improved a great deal. This confirmed Hari's neurofeedback work. Hari did a neurofeedback study, and he looked at people with insomnia, those who had just racy heads, but they were fairly relaxed somatically, so their bodies were quite relaxed, and those who were both tense physically and had racy heads. And he tried SMR, and he also tried theta. And what he found was that theta worked best for the group that was physically tense and mentally anxious, and that SMR worked best for the anxious group only. And that didn't make sense to him because SMR, which is an idling rhythm for the motor strip, should have worked best for the group that was also physically tense, but it was reversed. It was counterintuitive. So he didn't believe his first study was done correctly and had it redone. And the second study confirmed his first study. Now we see this issue with entrainment. With entrainment, a lot of people who start with insomnia issues, they're physically tense and they got a whole bunch of anxieties from work and life and home stuff that's going on. So racy-headed and tense bodies. We put them on Schumann, often is a very popular protocol for sleep at 7.8 hertz. And we have other ones in the theta range too. And it works remarkably well for about a month, and then it quits working. And it took us a few years to wrap our heads around why this was going on. But after about a month, because entrainment is so effective at calming us physically, they became just the racy-headed group, which means we had to switch them up to SMR after about a month's time. And so we've learned that now that, yep, often Schumann or theta for the first month, and then as the effectiveness starts to wear off, we'll switch them up to a faster frequency like SMR or even alpha betas often, but they need to go faster to shut down the racy-headed part. Here's a study done by Tang and their group out of Western Washington. And they're looking here at seniors, average age 88 years of age. They're giving them 8 hertz entrainment. They're going actually 8 hertz to 1, which again, I wouldn't do, but that's the magic of entrainment. The frequency isn't often is the least of what entrainment does. Anyway, they went slowly ramped down from 8 hertz to 1 over a 30-minute period. They went to sleep with the gear on. They looked at the Insomnia Severity Index and the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index and the Patient Health Questionnaire. And we can see these improvements pre-post. And look at the sleep latency. I mean, cut at less than half, as well as the ISI showing quite an improvement as well. Here we're looking at the other measures, the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality. So sleep quality was improved tremendously. This is poor sleep quality when the bar is high. Daytime issues, sleep quality, and depression. And depression, of course, went down significantly as well. So that's what they used. Interesting protocol, and it certainly seemed to work. We ran and published an SAD study many years ago, and we gave them a placebo condition of subdelta, and then we gave them a treatment condition of 20 hertz. Now, people with SAD aren't getting stimulation of the pineal gland, and they have long streams of alpha that go on for many, many seconds. Instead of having proper spindles of 1 or 2 seconds, they're 20, 30 seconds. And that's part of the whole foggy-headed issue that they have from underactivation of the pineal gland and too much melatonin circulating around in the brain. So here's the Beck depression, and this was taken December, January or so. And you can see in the controls, depression is going up. It started in November and December, January. Here we had the treatment group was matched with controls, gave them the placebo. Now they had some improvement with placebo, and that could just be some of the generic natures of entrainment. Gave them 20 hertz stimulation intended to inhibit the 10 hertz alpha they make, and then they had dramatic improvements. We can see that in terms of the percentage of those who are non-depressed, non-anxious female and non-anxious males improved dramatically. In fact, not one male had anxiety after the treatment group. Social life improved across the board and mood problems went down. And here was something that was interesting too, because their brain is running slow, they're craving carbs to try to stimulate their brain and also probably drive up serotonin and so on. So during the study, when we gave them placebo, they lost 3 pounds in that 2-week period. When we gave, 4-week period. When we gave them 20 hertz, they lost another 6.5 pounds, totaling 9.5 pounds. Well, yeah, that part of the group was very excited. And we certainly sold a number of devices to that part of the group. And you can see here, overeating, appetite, carb intake, and energy. I mean, when you have all those reversals going on, it's definitely a good recipe for weight loss. Okay, other non-cognitive studies that I've not covered because they're just very small. I'm just covering the larger ones. I'm showing you, the better scientific evidence. But we have little case studies on this and that. We have another little one on anxiety that I didn't show. I have a lot of, mostly my work on concussion and TBI, which I'll be showing in another lecture. Last year's lecture is posted on YouTube and on our website, but I'll be redoing it again. There was a small study done on PMS with Duncan Anderson. I'll get into a little more stuff with epilepsy and seizure, as we saw here, and entrainment with altered states of consciousness. So if you think you want to see a study in one of these topics, just feel free to send us an email and I'll shoot it to you. I said they're small studies, they're definitely pilot studies, but they might be enough to stimulate you into giving them a try, or if you're doing research, to taking this to the next level. Next one will be matters of the heart. We've done some amazing things with heart rate variability, and entrainment works best on the toughest patients to treat with heart rate variability and anxiety issues. It just cuts through them like butter. And so I'll be showing you this and the results of that. After that, we have more, of course, we have more webinars to go. I'll be still talking about peak performance, about the TBI, protocol design, redo transcranial DC stimulation. I have one up currently, but we've been adding to it since then. And I really want to teach about EEG. Meanwhile, thank you very much for attending my lecture. I really appreciate it that you have faith in me and that you trust in my ability to show you scientifically validated empirical data. And I wish you the very best, and I wish you all good health. Thank you.